Good evening, my name is Sabrina and my reputation is on the growing wealth disparity in the United States continues to perpetuate the cycle that oppresses the less fortunate. My opponent's three secondary claims were: one, wealth inequality results due to the lack of proper funding of educational institutions in the lower income areas because wealth ultimately determines the opportunity of educational mobility. Second, wealth inequality also negatively affects societal outlook. And third, economic inequality gives the wealthier more power and control to an unfathomable degree over the lives of others. My opponent's first claim was supported by the Federal Department of Education, in where she states that the richest 25% of school districts receive more funds from state and local governments per student than the poorest 25% of school districts. In response to this claim, I found an article from an author named John Fernsterbach, who is an editor at large in EdSource, and he said that in public schools, an average per student expenditure is $12,605, according to the academic school year 2015 to 2016. In Utah, it's $6,000. In New York, it's $19,000. In Massachusetts, it's $20,000, and in California, it's $10,000. Another piece of evidence that I found that refutes this position is that in the National Center of Education, the United States public schools are funded by state, local, and federal governments. This funding is reliant on income and property taxes. So this means that the funds are not based on whether you're rich or poor. It's based on where you are located and your income and property taxes. My opponent's second claim of evidence is that the wealthy has a negative effect on societal outlook, and she uses evidence that with greater income inequality, which leads to wealth inequality, this amplifies and intensifies the effects of social status differentiation. In response to this argument, an article from a senior writer of CS Monitor, she says that you can see how being empathetic provides a better ability to respond to social threats. So according to this evidence, is that power it may degrade the poor, but in reality the poor are more open to social harm if there is any. My opponent's third claim was supported by an article from the LA Times, which states that there was a significant drop in middle class wealth in terms of home prices and collapsing stock values. My response to this claim that she had was that the upper class doesn't have an effect on housing prices, and it's based on the people who live on those properties. An article from The Atlantic held a survey in 2014 which stated that 38% of Americans could cover a $1,000 emergency room visit or a $500 repair with money they'd save. Another report was done by the Pew Charitable Trust Fund, and 55% of the households didn't have enough liquid savings to support themselves. And 56% of people were worried about their finances in the previous year, and 71% were concerned about having enough money to cover everyday expenses. So by this, the upper class does not affect housing prices, and the main reason why the middle class had to move out of their local areas was because of their poor spending habits. Thank you.
Okay, the structural stuff at the beginning is fine. On the first point where you're arguing about the education issue, the idea about how much money we spend on average in different places, I think that's pretty good. I think one of the things, though, that you need to do is kind of correlate that. You mentioned Utah, the spending is low, $6,000 per pupil. Do we have any information about how successful students from Utah are in comparison to others? Is there anything about the income inequity that suggests that people in Utah have less wealth or less success as a consequence of spending less money? I think one of the things you want to point out is that the spending is largely dependent upon the conditions in the area. You have to pay people more in some places to live in those places because they can't afford to live there otherwise, and that's why the costs go up. It's not because Massachusetts has so much money that they spend more per pupil and they get so much more. It's that, if you want to live in Massachusetts, you have to have a high enough income to be able to afford to do so, and maybe that's why they have to pay teachers more. In other words, I think you need to look at the underlying cause of the disparity in what spending is going on and not just how much money is available. I think you've got the right idea there, but it doesn't go far enough. The second piece of information that you have on this, I'm not sure helps you very much, because you do say that the spending is based primarily on property taxes, which of course are largely dependent on the wealth of people. You have a higher property value, you're going to be paying more property taxes, which means there's more money in the schools. So that actually, I think, kind of feeds into the argument that the advocate's presenting instead of giving you an out on that point. On your second point, you've got this argument about empathy, and I'm trying to figure out where's there information that suggests that poor people are more empathetic, that they have some advantage over rich people. That seems to be the presumption that's going on here. This argument was not very clear to begin with, and it really seems to make a lot of assumptions about the nature of people in these different classes, and I think you might want to be careful about that. I don't think it gets you much in the long run, so unless you had more proof on it, I would try to find a different argument to make on that particular point. The third point talks about the income disparity issue again, and you seem to be making the argument here that says that, that's basically what you finish at the end, is that the middle class spends their money poorly, and that's why they are in this situation, and so they've basically screwed themselves. I think there are probably better answers on this, that, for example, the decline in the middle class property values, I assume it's largely associated with the housing bust that happened a few years ago, and that you could associate that, for example, with bad spending habits or poor decision making about borrowing. That would be okay. But you make it sound like the middle class is out there spending money on stuff that they don't need, and you don't really have any evidence on that. And it just comes down to, well, people haven't saved enough money. Well, if they're poor, they can't. It's harder to save money, and I think that that's a perfectly legitimate answer that the other side would come back. The fact that almost 40% of the country couldn't come up with the $500 that they need to get a home repair or an auto repair or whatever kind of thing that is that you're talking about there. Well, there's a reason that people don't have the money saved up, and that's because they don't have the money, which kind of, again, feeds the argument that the advocate's presenting, not the argument that you want to be making. All right, thank you.